Recently, Senator Bernie Sanders introduced legislation to end cash bail, a move he said was necessary in part to lift the financial burden of bail from the people ensnared in a racist criminal justice system. But Sanders' effort raises a deeper question: just how much law enforcement has become a profit center for the government and the people who work in it. Make no mistake, cash bail is profitable. Just look at the billion-dollar insurance companies who fund it. But that's just the beginning of the cash windfall for cops, prosecutors, and private prisons. In 2013, police departments around the country seized $4 billion in cash and property through asset forfeiture, and many of the people who lost property were never charged with a crime. And then you have private companies involved in the parole process and prisons. And of course, the biggest boondoggle that rarely gets mentioned: overly generous police pensions and benefits. To help me sort this out and follow the money, I'm joined by two guests who spent a lifetime studying it. Professor Doug Colbert teaches at the University of Maryland Law School and has led numerous efforts to reform the state's criminal justice system, including a recent effort to end cash bail in the state. And Stephen Janis is an investigative reporter for the Real News Network. He has taught journalism and digital media at Johns Hopkins University and Towson University. And he's the author of 3 books on policing, including Why Do We Kill? The Pathology of Murder in Baltimore. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me start with you. Bail is, essentially a state issue.
Yeah.
What is Senator Bernie Sanders proposing?
Well, his proposal will try to leverage the resources of the federal government to incentivize states to get rid of bail. And there's 2 prongs for that. One is to offer grants to states for more robust pretrial services, which would allow courts and judges to have more information about a defendant who comes in for bail. And that's been a big complaint about eliminating bail, is that judges are afraid to let people go because of, they can't get enough information about the defendant. So one aspect of it is to create federal funding stream for states that undertake eliminating bail so that they can then invest in these services for judges and prosecutors. And the other thing would be to punish states that continue to have cash bail by taking away grants for other criminal justice programs. So it's sort of a, carrot and stick kind of approach, where on one aspect, states will get more money if they decide to go without cash bail, and on the other aspect, if they decide to continue cash bail, they will lose out on federal funding. So that's the main way that I think he wants to accomplish some action on the state level.
Professor Colbert, what do you think about Senator Sanders' proposed piece of legislation?
Well, I think it's an important step in the right direction. I think it follows efforts by Congressman Ted Lieu and Senator Kamala Harris and Rand Paul, all of whom are trying to reduce the use of money bail. But the bail bondsman industry is a very lucrative business. It's a very powerful business. And when we did our report for the Able Foundation back in 2001, we learned that the bail bondsmen collect between $100 million and $150 million in Maryland alone.
Now, something that Senator Sanders mentioned was that in 2016, there were 700,000 people sitting in city and county jails around the country, and that 65% of those people were unconvicted, which means over 400,000 people were sitting in jail that had not been convicted of a crime. How is that constitutional? How is that not a debtor's prison?
Well, it's about 450,000 to be, to bring it up to date. And what happens is that judges are supposed to hold people without bail if there's clear and convincing evidence that that individual represents a danger to others or generally to the community. So it's what we call a carefully limited exception to the rule that says that people are entitled to their freedom. And I'm actually quoting a Supreme Court case when I say that. So the other way that judges hold people in jail is if they think they're going to be a flight risk, that they're not going to return to court, they're going to leave the country. But we should be talking about a very small percentage of people who are arrested. Instead, what we're seeing here in Maryland, in Baltimore, and elsewhere in the country, we're seeing judges holding people without bail in very large numbers, concluding that they're a danger to others or that they're a flight risk, but in my opinion, without the necessary evidence.
Now, Senator Sanders currently has no co-sponsors on this bill, but Representative Ted Lieu is having a little bit more success. What kind of challenges do you think Senator Sanders is going to face in trying to pass this legislation?
Well, just seeing from covering the issue here locally at the state level in Annapolis, the bail industry has tremendous influence because it has a lot of money, as Professor Colbert points out. They got a lot of cash on hand, and they can give it to politicians. And so politicians pay attention. I mean, one of the things we emphasized in our coverage was Maryland is supposedly a liberal state, right? But the support for the bail industry, which is decidedly illiberal, was phenomenal. I mean, it was very difficult. I mean, people have to understand the way bail reform happened here, as Professor Colbert can explain better than myself, is that the Maryland Court of Appeals issued a rule saying, you have to consider the defendant's economic position before you impose bail. So it wasn't really legislation. But then the state legislature got together and said, well, let's revoke that rule, right? I mean, that's basically what happened. And so it's really difficult on a political level to fight the money that this industry generates. And it generates huge sort of economic rents on a population. The concept of taking money that's just kind of there like gambling. It's not like they're inventing products or creating, buildings or something. They're just taking money out of people's pockets who are the most vulnerable. It's a great business. And for that reason, I think they have a lot of political capital.
Yeah, the amount of money that bondsmen will spend to protect their private industry is limitless.
Yeah.
Because they're not only giving money back. See, what happens is when you go to a bail bondsman, and if you're arrested on driving while intoxicated, if your bail is $10,000, you must give the bondsman $1,000. It's non-refundable. So the case could be dismissed tomorrow, but once you give the $1,000, that money is gone.
That's gone.
And when you add up the volume of arrests, and during this period, of course, we've seen zero tolerance in our state and our
100,000
city.
arrests a year.
Yeah, I mean,
that's a lot of business.
Again, when you're talking about the good years for the bondsman, when Governor, then Mayor O'Malley was in office, there were so many arrests in the city. We had 105,000 arrests. Today we have 24,000.
Huge difference.
So the amount of money that's generated from all those arrests, because people want to get out of jail.
For those keeping score at home, that was Martin O'Malley, who was mayor, the Democratic candidate for president who supposedly was a liberal and progressive. Just so you know, he was also the architect of zero tolerance. And I think we should make that point clear to anyone watching, that that's the same man if you see him out in public touting his liberal principles, just remember he was the architect of arresting 100,000 people a year in the city for 7 years.
Well, I know people in Baltimore City aren't going to forget that. We
No.
just have to make sure that people in the rest of the country also remember
I just want to make
that
that point because it should be elaborated upon.
Stephen, Professor Colbert brought up that there were specific legislatures that received a lot of money from the bail bonds industry. Can you talk a little bit about that?
He already said this. It was Bobby Zirkin, who was chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and Joseph Valeria, who was the former chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Just so people know, the Judiciary Committees are where all the legislation regarding bail and other law enforcement type, like police reform, have to go through before they can be voted on by the full body of the Senate. And those guys had hundreds of thousands of dollars from the bail industry. In fact, we went to a shindig during the whole bail reform issue down at Ruth Chris, which is a steakhouse down in Annapolis. And you could just see the people from the bail industry rolling in and the politicians walking in. And, they went into a big steak dinner with, free wine and free everything.
That night, yeah.
Doug was there. So, the money, as he points out, is pretty much endless. They have cash like no one else has cash. And those two key people, you can't get bail reform through the legislature without going through those committees. So they basically have given the gatekeepers on any type of reform and conversely on any type of legislation to reinstitute bail to the people who are going to make the primary decisions about what happens. So it's pretty much impossible.
And I would say that the leadership of the Senate also.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they wouldn't be there if Mike Miller, the Senate president, and Bush didn't want those guys to be there doing what they're doing. I mean, those would be the only two people who, if they made a call to Bobby Zirkin and said, "Hey, we want this bail reform to pass," he'd pass it.
Of course.
Yeah, but other than that, that's a good point. Mike Miller, and the people who run the Senate and the House also are heavily influenced by that.
Now, Professor Colbert, you mentioned that there was a rule issued by the Special Court of Appeals. I think there was a report done that has shown that cash bail being issued has gone down, but also people being held without bail has gone up. Can you talk about some of the implications of this new rule and how it's working?
Yes, well, I mean, there's always the good news, bad news dilemma here. The good news is that fewer judges are ordering money bail. So money bail has gone from maybe 60 or 65% of the time to now it's about 15% of people being held in Baltimore City Jail. And the numbers are pretty good for the rest of the state, too. That's being used about 15 or 20% of the time to hold people in jail. But at the same time, what you've got is you've got a situation where more and more judges are denying bail to people. So we have this situation. I'll just use Baltimore City as an example. You've got a population there of a little over 2,000, about 2,300 people who are waiting for trial in pretrial jail. There are about 80%, about 1,700 of the 2,300 people are being held on no bail. Now, you have to keep in mind, because I've looked at the recent statistics, that there's about 200 people, a little less than 200, who are being held on what they call the serious or the violent crime. So that leaves a lot of other people. If you've got a population of 2,300, about 200 are there on violent crime. Who are the rest of the people? Well, more than half of them are people who miss their court dates. They fail to appear, so they have a warrant. And when you get a warrant, many of the judges will order a bail that people cannot afford. And at the same time, many judges will deny bail because you missed your court date. So the taxpayer winds up paying for the 30 to 45 days before those relatively minor cases get resolved. Most of them are misdemeanor cases. We have to move away from a system where poor people are staying in jail because they can't afford bail. Now we have a system where many poor and low-income people are being denied bail on misdemeanor charges.
So essentially, we're hearing that there's some mixed results from this new rule. But what do bail reform advocates say?
Well, exactly what Doug said, that they feel like the rule isn't being implemented in the full spirit of how it was intended by the Court of Appeals, that judges are defaulting to no bail in cases where they might have given, excessive bail, and that's not really the point. The point is to not impose bail unless person is a flight risk, and that's where I think the Sanders component of the bill becomes very important in terms of funding pretrial services, because that's, I think, the excuse they're using, kind of like saying, well, I don't know, I don't want to let this person out, and as Professor Colbert points out very adroitly, is that if you miss one court date, they look at that as like some sort of, you're a flight risk, you're dangerous, you're whatever. But missing a court date is pretty easy in a city where people get arrested quite often, and there's not a good public transportation system. As a matter of fact, the Able Foundation did a study and found that people who got text messages reminding them to go to court were actually more effective than bail in terms of getting people to show up.
It's been shown in many places.
Yeah, just a text message.
Just a text message, a phone call,
right.
Just a reminder,
Yeah.
because we forget things.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing...
And these are, as Doug pointed out, these are minor charges. This isn't like a murder case, This is like I was driving without a license or something.
But even for the serious felony charges, the government has the burden of showing that you're a danger to another person, because we have this presumption of innocence, which is like a bedrock principle of our system.
What are you talking about? There's no presumption of innocence.
Well,
with asset forfeiture.
But when we have this principle, and lawyers will remind judges about this and say, look, Your Honor, I understand my client's charged with a serious crime, but there's nothing in his past that would show that he or she is not going to come back to court, not a danger to anyone, will return to court, has very strong ties in the community. A judge in those situations either has to decide that there is clear evidence of danger or should be setting a bail that's not excessive. But the people that we're seeing in the jail are people who would do much better in a different environment, And the interesting thing, I just wanted to add to your transportation argument about
Yeah.
people coming to court, surprisingly to some, more than 90% of the people in Baltimore make their court appearances,
It's a very
which is
small
higher
percentage.
than the national
interesting.
Yeah.
percentage, despite bad
And
transportation.
also there's been no evidence that not having bail, people are less likely to show up. Like the whole thing the bail industry said, no one's going to show up to court if you get rid of bail. That hasn't panned out at all.
Not at all, because people are responsible. And that's the underlying part of this is the racism that's attached to African American people, to other people of color. There's this idea that, no, I can't trust you. You're not going to, why? Because you missed court, 2 years ago or 5 years ago, or you have twice you've missed court in your life, or whatever the number is. And you have to look at that and say, all right, so maybe I missed court, maybe I had a good reason, maybe I had a job I didn't want to lose, but you can't just use something that's happened a while ago and then conclude no bail. You're going to lose your freedom for 5 or 6 weeks.
Especially when there's no behavior outside of that to
That's right.
justify. Like, if you shot up a bar, yeah, but most of the time there's nothing to justify in terms of behavioral patterns.
It's punishment. It's
Yeah.
punishment for missing your
But I
court
do think,
date.
don't you think a lot of it though has to do with trying to keep this system that we see, anybody who comes to Baltimore sees there's this massive prison complex right in the middle of town. Don't they want to just keep feeding it? So there's kind of I'd say a bit of a conspiratorial attitude between judges, probation officers, keep people in it. We got to keep it going.
So one thing always to make clear is that there are many conscientious judges, parole officers, probation
From your
officers,
perspective.
police, people who are professional, and they do a very good job there. So this is not a condemnation of everyone who's in the system. But then there's another group of people, and often they are the dominant group, who have a very different attitude towards the same population. And it's very difficult for the conscientious, say, police officer to be doing the job that he or she swore to do when there's a culture around that has a very different message.
Professor Colbert is very magnanimous, but as a reporter, I will counter what he says, and I say he's overstating the conscientious aspect of the criminal justice system. I mean, we just had the gun trace task force, which was 7 officers who were basically stealing overtime, dealing drugs.
8.
8. It's 8, right. It's actually up to 9, one from Philadelphia.
Right.
And it wasn't a cop that turned him in or any of these conscientious people you were talking about. They didn't exist.
Right.
Good
It was
point.
just that one of the cops was stupid enough to get caught in a wire from an unrelated case. So as well as I respect Professor Colbert for his statements, but I will say as a reporter, if there are conscientious people in the system, they're not doing anything to forward the integrity of the system, because otherwise those cops wouldn't be able to get away with literally.
Maybe they need the opportunity, Steve. Maybe if we had something like they did in New York years ago, where they had a Mullen commission, a Knapp commission, where they had public
I think it's a good
hearings,
idea.
and people could come forward, and the honest, hardworking people in the justice system could come forward and speak about what they are confronted with within their own department. We have to be able to get at the core of whatever is not working well. We want an even playing field for low-income working people, for poor people. Money should not be the determinant of who regains their liberty.
Certainly.
And if we can take the profit out of it, we can help the judges make better decisions with empirical data, with other kinds of information. So I know we can do a better job in our own pretrial justice system.
Stephen, what kind of role have you seen money play in our criminal justice system? What do you think happens as what Professor Colbert says, you introduce profit motive into law enforcement or the criminal justice system?
Well, let's look at it this way. There's very few professions where with a high school education you can come and get a job in Baltimore City, make $170,000 a year, get a free take-home car, a lifetime pension, and health benefits. But that is what the Baltimore City Police affords you. And when you look around, you see crumbling rec centers and streets that are disrepaired. Remember that the majority of the city's budget goes into policing. And it's not just the police department getting $500 million a year on top of all sorts of other grants. It's the fact that these police officers get lifetime pensions. They can retire when they're 50 and live on a police pension for years. For a while, it used to just be 20 years. And people could retire when they're 42, and the city would pay them for years. So there is something like close to $3 or $4 billion in the police pension fund.
It's an incredible amount of money.
And the department routinely gives out take-home cars to police officers. We actually, you and I did some video where we caught them, a whole lot full of beautiful cars. And then compare that to the state of the city schools where they don't have heat, right? But police have take-home cars. It's the one thing that people forget to mention. And we saw it in the gun trace task force, right? I'm down on vacation and I'm collecting overtime. You're making $100 an hour while you're sitting on the beach. What industry would afford that of anybody? And as Professor Kolber's point out, is based primarily on this idea of fear. You know, we are afraid. Be afraid of crime, and the only thing that can stop it is policing. And so policing has been able in this city to make itself the economic engine, or I would say the economic recipient of almost all the city's largest. Just this last month, because police overtime spending was so out of control, the city council was asked to approve a $21 million supplemental, which was all the excess tax revenue the city collected from recordation taxes, which is taxes related to real estate. All of it. All of it. No money for schools, no money for rec centers, no money for after-school programs, no money for fixing parks. All of it went to policing. And yet we have the most violent city in the country. We are rated year over year the most violent city, and yet we pay more and more money into policing. Now that to me sounds like a confidence game, right? You know, I mean, that to me sounds like you're running some sort of swindle. Sorry, but I'm an investigative reporter. I've looked at it for years. It's insane.
Professor Kolber, tell me what have been some of the implications of you seeing money play a role in the criminal justice system from your perspective?
Well, whenever you're talking about money, you're providing an incentive for people to make decisions not based on the evidence or the facts, but because some people stand to gain or lose from it. So to me, the money really corrupts a system. And bail bondsmen are all too willing to share some of their profit, you know, for people who are running for office. So knowing how difficult it is to run for office, most people are willing to take money from wherever it's coming from, but then they're beholden to the folks who are giving them significant amounts. There's also, you know, there's also money in the criminal justice system. Talking about the task force and the convictions of 8 high-ranking police officers, one of the parts of that trial revealed that the leader of the task force, Sergeant Jenkins, actually brought along a bail bondsman on one of his biggest illegal arrests and extortion and robberies. And it was a person who apparently had a good deal of drugs in the house, and the bail bondsman was given those drugs, and according to his sworn testimony at federal trial, he sold over $1 million worth of drugs, and then shared that money with Sergeant Jenkins. Now, there had to be a trusted relationship there over a long period of time. Is he the only bail bondsman that would have a close relationship with police?
It makes me think of how during the Freddie Gray uprising, how there were drugs that were looted from pharmacies, and everyone said, what happened to those drugs? Who's dealing those drugs?
Exactly.
And it turned out one of the members of the gun trace task force was involved in the distribution.
It was actually
of those
the
drugs.
current commissioner, Batts, said that that was what was fueling the violence, was those drugs stolen were being dealt by people in the city and fueling the violence. When it turns out, as Professor Goldwood points out, it actually ended up in a bail bondsman's house out in the county.
And you're dealing with detectives and sergeants on a police force, leaders. And are they the only ones? You know, for a lot of people, they need to be convinced that the problem hasn't gone deeper. And I'm never in favor of trying to push things under a carpet and sort of pretend that everything's okay. I think we really could use that kind of public investigative hearings, and I think it would do the city a lot of good.
I think we should call it the Colbert Commission.
That has a nice ring to it. So, Stephen, I wanted to ask you this. You cover the Maryland legislature, and you've been speaking with advocates. What do you see to be their challenges next year? I think I've heard
Yeah.
that there's going to be a pushback against the
Well, that's what we were
reforms.
talking about, Professor Colbert, before the show. There's a lot of expectation that the same forces that tried to override this rule will again try to reinstitute cash bail, and will use some of the findings that we discussed before as an impetus for that, by saying, you know, well, there's so many people who are in for, you know, no bail. If we just have cash bail again, that won't be the case. So really, the expectation is that there will be another push by all the same forces to reinstitute bail, cash bail in the state.
And I expect they're going to do it in a very charming way. They're going to say, you know, despite the laudable efforts of the reformers to make our system a fair and just one, actually what's happening is that many people, more people are in jail now on no bail. And so what we really want to do is go back to the old system of a money bail. And what they're not telling the public is how much money is involved in that system, who has to pay the bondsman to get out of jail. And if we do have a problem with the way the system is currently working, then we should fix that problem. You know, it seems to me that one day soon, I hope, our highest court is going to have the opportunity to clarify for all the judges of the state that those rules changes were intended not to substitute unaffordable bail with no bail, but to tell the judges, look, we have other options here. Our job is to get people back to court, and unless you've got really clear evidence that somebody's a danger, you have to be able to give people non-financial conditions if they're poor, or to give them conditions that they're able to meet. And that's the biggest thing right now. I think we're going to need the Court of Appeals intervention.
Well, Professor Colbert, I think that's going to have to be the last word. And I think if there is $1.4 to $2.4 billion a year being generated by the bail industry nationwide, that we're going to continue to see a pushback, and the advocates are going to have their work cut out for them. Absolutely. I'd like to thank my guests, Stephen Janis of the Real News Network and Professor Doug Colbert of the University of Maryland Law School. I'm your host, Taya Graham, and I want to thank you for joining me at the Real News Network.